Evans-Cario, President of SugarSpun Marketing, author of Pinterest Marketing an Hour a Day, and the Social Media Faculty Chair at MarketMotive. Thanks for joining me for part 1 in my series on Pinterest marketing. If you think about how bookmarking has traditionally worked in the world of the web, it's text-based. If you use the bookmarks or the favorites that are built into your browser, you tend to end up with big long lists and folders of just all sorts of text links that we really don't go back and end up using that much later down the line, because a lot of times we don't take the time to customize those descriptions, and it becomes kind of difficult to remember why we might have even put them in there in the first place. Now with Pinterest, on the other hand, because everything has a visual context to it, there's a much higher level of recall. It's much easier to say, not just I'm looking for that corn fritter recipe, but here's the specific corn fritter recipe I'm looking at because I remember that image behind it. Or when you're looking for inspiration of what you might want to have as an outdoor project this year, maybe you're looking for that infographic that had that data you needed for your presentation, it's much easier to go back in and find it visually than it is to go through, again, the traditional text-based bookmarks that most of us are used to working with. It's also a place to go for inspiration and to gather new ideas, not just to save the ideas that you found other places on the web, but to browse through specific topics and to spot those little pieces of information that you say, hey, this has value to me. I want to save that and categorize that as well, finding inspiration on those topics that you enjoy and that you're interested in. To that extent, it's made a lot of changes in the way that we do idea searching online. And in fact, we've even started to see a little bit of changes in the way Google and Bing start to present some of their information because of the influence that we see Pinterest having on how people search. So if you think about going to Google or going to Bing and running a search, say for blackberry cobbler, the results that you get back may have a couple ads here and there. They may have some images, but for the most part, they're going to be text-based descriptions that have maybe the added credibility of a website you recognize, but you don't really know what you're going to get on the other end until you click that link, go through to the site, and actually look on it. Now, when you run that same search on Pinterest, you're instantly getting a visual representation of the content. And if you're looking for a specific type of blackberry cobbler, becomes a lot easier to take a look and say, oh wow, that one sounds wonderful. But you're also reading curated descriptions that are added by human beings rather than the metadata or the relevant content off the page that's pulled by a search engine algorithm and plugged into that space. Now, Pinterest also makes it very easy for you to refine your search, as you can see across the top. Maybe you want an easy blackberry cobbler recipe, or maybe you want a blackberry cobbler recipe with oats. They can take the user data and the way the information is saved and collected within Pinterest and help you refine those searches further. So it also has a heavy impact, again, on the way that people are now doing discovery for different ideas and concepts. So it's important to be able to look at Pinterest in sort of the broader context of what we're used to with social media. So if, for example, Pinterest is one of the newer channels to you, but maybe you're familiar with Facebook because Facebook is sort of the behemoth of all things social media. Having a little bit of side-by-side comparison can be a helpful way to put Pinterest into perspective. So when we look at monthly usage data for the two sites, the average person spends about 7 hours a month on Facebook and about 90 minutes a month on Pinterest. Now, at its surface, that would seem like people are way more invested in Facebook than they are in Pinterest. And to an extent, that's true. Again, it has a higher usage rate, it has more frequent visit rate, but it's also important to understand the context of how we use these two sites. Because Facebook is a place that is a destination rather than a starting point. We go to Facebook to participate in conversations, to see what people are interested in and talking about, and to a great extent, to have that conversation and engagement on Facebook itself. Pinterest, on the other hand, is sort of a strange hybrid of, say, a search engine and a social media site because it's a starting point. It's the place that we go to either build our collection, to look at other people's collections, or for inspiration. So we're spending as much time off-site as we are on-site. Again, the same way that you might go to Google 20 times a day, but not spend more than 10 or 15 minutes total during the day on the site because you're using the site to get yourself to another location. So where Facebook becomes that place where you're engaging with your fans. Pinterest is the place where you're attracting your fans, researching them and what their likes and what their interests are. So again, Facebook is a place where we're going and we're trying to get people to stay and engage and interact with us and sort of spread things around. But with Pinterest, there's sort of an understanding that you're getting a touch point in front of them and you're getting an interest point in front of them, but ideally they're finding their way into your site, into your content. Again, it's a launch point rather than the actual engagement location. There's still a lot of misconceptions about the site, who uses it, how they use it, whether or not it's a good fit for a particular business or brand. So I want to clear up some of the misconceptions that a lot of marketers and a lot of business owners still have. A lot of people still look at Pinterest as sort of the way it originally launched, which was mostly about women either planning their wedding or ones who wish they were still planning their wedding because suddenly they had all these great ideas. There's a little bit of designers and foodies mixed in, and maybe some men, hiding in the very, very corners and edges of the Pinterest universe. But for the most part, Pinterest was originally all fashion, makeup, beauty, food, and home design. Now, we've seen a lot of changes in the demographics over the last couple of years. In fact, there really is sort of a new reality, and we're seeing a continued creep towards this new reality. So currently, nearly a third of Pinterest users are actually men. 71% are women, 29% are men. That accounts for about 13% of the male internet population now having a Pinterest account, whereas 42% of female internet users have an account. Now, when we look a little bit beyond sort of just the male-female demographic, the financial numbers, they're pretty good. 64%, nearly two-thirds of them make more than $50,000 a year, and a pretty good percentage of them also make more than $100,000 a year. Now, one of the areas that Pinterest does differ from some of the other channels like Twitter is that it's a very non-urban environment. So if we look at a channel like Twitter, we see a very high urban population, much higher adoption rates there. But with Pinterest, we see a lot more suburban and even way more rural than we see on some of the other channels. Again, it's just a different demographic that's checking in here. So it becomes a unique place to go and reach some of the people that you might have a more difficult time reaching on some of the other platforms and channels. 2014 was really a banner year for men on Pinterest, and we really, by the end of that year, saw a lot of very significant changes. They accounted for 33% of all the new signups coming in, and if you go outside of the United States, that's roughly 50% of the signups that are happening. So we saw 73% year-over-year growth in men registering for the site. I think women will probably always be the dominant demographic that's on the site, but I think we're going to continue to see the number of men increase a little bit more until we sort of reach a leveling off. Now, an important thing to note, again, when you think about how you're getting in front of your audience and whether or not it's a worthwhile place to check out, it's very important to realize more men now read Pinterest each month than Sports Illustrated and GQ combined. So again, we're getting really good depth of insight. Now, when we look at emerging markets, Korea, India, China, the numbers are even better. Men make up half of all users, not half of signups, not half of growth. It's literally a 50-50 split when we look at some of those emerging markets. So if you're doing a lot of international marketing, or if you're primarily focused on international marketing, it becomes even more important to look at Pinterest and how you might work it into your outreach efforts. Now, some of the top categories for men, because most people are very familiar with which ones perform best for women, food, home design, gardening, fashion, all of those perform really well for women. When we look at the categories for men, geek tends to be the number one category. So anything, technology, geeky oriented does really well. Cars and motorcycles, men's fashion does extremely well. Gardening performs very well for men. Architecture, humor, and health and fitness tend to really be the places where there's the most activity going on. But in this day and age, you can also go into foodie, you can go into outdoors, travel, you can go into a variety of different boards, and you're still going to see a lot of active pinning and engagement and interaction by men. Now, with all of this discovery and with growing demographics coming into the site, it also means that Pinterest has some pretty impressive traffic potential. Looking at some of the stats that have come out, Pecora has done a great job of sort of tracking to see how do people engage with Pinterest, what's going on with the site. we find that the average pin drives 2 visits and 6 page views. It's also worth an average of about 78 cents in sales. Now, when we look at this in terms of sort of virality, we see that the average pin also receives 11 repins. Now, if you're a big Twitter user, you're familiar with the idea of retweets. So to give you a little perspective on that, that makes the average pin roughly 100 times more viral than the average tweet, which receives, what, about 0.1% repins or 0.01% repins. So again, when we look at the potential for things to spread and move around at a faster pace, Pinterest has a lot of potential. But one of the other interesting things about Pinterest is the latent nature of traffic and purchases that come in from it. It's not uncommon for a pin to go up, have a really big traffic spike, then it sort of dies off, and then someone else discovers it, because they're running a search or they're looking somewhere. They pin it, it gets back into the feed nice and fresh, traffic spikes again. Or people pin content without having visited the site to read it, and then they go back and review it later. So roughly half of all visits that come in from Pinterest occur 3 months after the original pin was released or the original pin was made, and about half of all orders occur 2 months after, which again, if people are researching Christmas lists, maybe putting together, potential purchase lists for things they're going to buy for their house or for themselves, it makes sense that they would do their research, do their gathering, and then go back at a later point to kind of dig in a little bit more and make that final purchase decision. Now, Pinterest also has some true e-commerce potential. It's not just about driving traffic. We've also found that Pinterest is very effective at getting those actual conversions. So looking at some of the Pinterest shopping stats, 47% of online shoppers have made a purchase based on a Pinterest recommendation. And when we look at e-commerce social sharing, now not social sharing in general, but sharing of products, things you intend to buy, Pinterest holds 41% of e-commerce social sharing. Now Facebook sits at 37 to give you a little bit of perspective. So again, far more e-commerce social sharing taking place on the Pinterest platform. And then when we look at purchases coming in, I mentioned 78 cents per pin is sort of the average, but when people actually do come in and convert and buy, we see an average purchase amount of $179 coming off of a Pinterest referral. If we compare that to Facebook, we get $80 at Facebook and $69 at Twitter. So if we want to do the math to put this in a little more perspective, that means that Pinterest generates on average 27% more revenue per click than Facebook does, and that it generates roughly 400% more revenue per click than Twitter. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because when people are on Twitter, they're usually checking to see what's the news, what's sort of the trending topics, what are people talking about. They're not necessarily in a shopping mindset. And when they're on Facebook, they're catching up with friends and with the news sources that they follow and kind of seeing, just what's the word, what's happening online. But when people are on Pinterest, they're in that sort of, small child going to McDonald's to get the latest Happy Meal toy, collect them all mode. They're in that mindset already of gathering and acquiring and collecting. And a lot of times they're using it specifically as part of their purchasing decisions. So they're already in a mental state or a mental mindset when they come into your website to be prepared for purchase. They're also going to be more apt to use something like Pinterest to research higher ticket items. So whether that's your wedding dress instead of maybe the little favors that you're going to buy from Michael's, or maybe it's, the leather couch that you're going to put in your living room instead of the pillow that you're going to pick up at Target. It's a higher end product that they're saving and collecting. So again, you're going to have a higher dollar amount when they actually do come through and make that purchase. Now, I also want to touch on the idea of Pinterest and how it has changed the value of images, because everyone knows image marketing over the last several years, it's become really hot. There's a lot of focus on it, and Pinterest has really played a big role in the development of that. Now, if we think back several years ago to the earlier days of social media, to YouTube and how YouTube changed video marketing, what happened with YouTube is that we had this explosion of consumer-generated content, and that content was very well received. In fact, when we looked at data way back in 2012, we could see that user-generated content and professionally produced content that was paired with user-generated content performed far better across the board than professionally produced only content. In other words, when it looked like it came from a quote real person rather than an advertising agency, people tend to relate to it better, share it more, and have a more positive response. The trust factor is higher. And that became a really great thing for businesses of all size because you didn't necessarily have to pour as much money and planning and skill set into every video you produced. There's still a place for professionally produced video, but it also meant it was a little more acceptable to not be at that rate. So for small businesses in particular, this was like a godsend in the marketing world. Now, unfortunately, we've sort of seen the exact opposite thing happen with Pinterest, because with Pinterest, we see the quality of images going up exponentially, and thus we see a need for that quality of images. And again, when you think about the visual context, why we go to Pinterest, what we're looking for, this makes sense very quickly. If you're going to Pinterest because you're looking for a little dinner inspiration, what are you going to make for dinner? And you run across a picture like this, you're not really going to be in a hurry to run home and make that, because what is it and why would I want to eat it? But when you pair the same recipe with a good quality image that lets you see, oh, well, that's an egg tart or it's a frittata. Okay, well, that looks a little better. That looks tastier. And this is what we're seeing happen with Pinterest, is we're seeing all of these bloggers and all of these websites that are producing amazing content and amazing video. You take a site like Smitten Kitchen. She's operating out of a 42 square foot kitchen in New York City. She doesn't have staff. There's no production studio there. She's not a trained chef, but she puts up the recipes that she makes and she pairs it with gorgeous photos that she takes herself. And she's pulling in millions of page views every single week and probably a nice chunk in advertising revenue as well. But the same way that we saw sort of amateurs dramatically change the nature of video marketing by using more amateurish content, again, we've seen the exact opposite happen with images, because in an environment that you need things to be so visually stimulating to stand out on that Pinterest page, the best quality content is what's going to reign supreme. And as you have people who are willing to put the time and effort in and who are creating better content, that's upping the bar for everyone else. So what it has meant for a lot of brands, big and small, is that relying so heavily on stock photography like they used to in the past doesn't work so well anymore. Not when you're competing with really unique, original, relevant images that people are taking of what they're producing. They're putting up not just a blog post, but a blog post that has 20 amazing images to go with it. And so we've seen this sort of across the board level of expectation that no matter what size company you are, you need to learn how to properly operate a camera, how to put some good lighting in there, and to really get some great imagery. Again, enterprise or small business, it's irrelevant at this point. The quality of your pictures must go up on your website if you want to reap the benefits and the rewards that come from the increased traffic from a service like Pinterest. So before we get into the next couple sets of videos for this series, I really want to sort of go back and kind of summarize this idea of why Pinterest is worth looking at if you're not already marketing in it, or why you might want to put some consideration into some of the different ways you might be able to leverage it. Really, at its core, Pinterest is probably the strongest site online in the social media world, playing off the impact of imagery. Photos weigh incredibly heavily. They are the currency of Pinterest, but that allows for really fast concept digestion. So unlike on a Twitter or unlike on a Facebook, where there's a lot of reading as you're scrolling through to figure out, is this something I'm interested in? We can react to and process images very quickly. So having the opportunity to get your content into that environment gives you a much better chance to really capture someone's eyes and get them to stop and take the time to read the description and potentially click through to the site. There's also a really low barrier to entry. It rivals Twitter in terms of how quickly you can get in there and set things up. For a base level Pinterest account, even getting your website verified, you're looking at 5 to 10 minutes to set up. Now, if you're going to go a little heavier duty with things like rich pins, which we'll talk about a little later in this series, there's going to be a little bit more effort there. But it basically has a really simple interface with minimal management. There's not a lot to it that is going to take up a ton of time and effort management-wise. There's also the ability to look at this as a chance for curation versus creation. And we're going to talk a little more in depth about that idea later in the series as well. But it basically gives you the opportunity to have a channel that you can play in without necessarily having to create all original content. There are some very successful and strategic ways to leverage Pinterest with other people's content rather than your own. And then finally, the ability to have content segmentation, which is another idea that we'll dig a little deeper into, gives you the chance to really target your consumers in a way that you can't do on any other social media channel. Because the idea that people can choose which areas of your content they want to follow, that allows you to curate much deeper into a topic than you would normally be able to. Now, there's tons of potential here for big brands. We see big companies, enterprise level businesses really leveraging it very creatively. One of the examples that I've used almost from the start with Pinterest is Chobani, because they have nonstop done an amazing job of marketing. And one of the things that they've said is it has really allowed them to show different sides of their personality. Again, that idea of the content segmentation and being able to dig a little deeper, it really lets people see more about what the brand of Chobani is and all the different ways that people are using their products. So whether Chobani's leveraging it to find recipes that they might want to send to their test kitchen to see about leveraging on their own blogs, research to see how customers are using their product. And from their end, while they're gathering a lot of insight and data, again, there's minimal engagement and management going on. They're not usually in there commenting. They don't have to read through a lot of comments and respond to them. They're mostly just curating and liking and repinning content. Now, for small brands, we see the same things. There's been a lot of companies that have done a really great job of leveraging Pinterest to get exposure. And Artifact Uprising is a great example of this. One of those companies that was a small, teeny tiny startup, literally working out of someone's basement, and they had a single product pin that generated almost 50,000 visitors into their site. And in 18 months, they went from basement startup to multi-million-dollar sales just because they got the right pin in front of the right person and got some really great exposure. So they've been using it to do a lot of A/B testing of products that they're looking to launch before they actually get them launched, just to see what the response is and what people seem to be interested in. And that's really given them, as a small company, the ability to gather a lot of really unique and creative data that otherwise might have cost them a lot of money to hire a market research firm to put together. So there's lots of different ways that companies of all sizes are really working to leverage Pinterest. So coming up in the next part of our series, we're going to talk a little bit about setting up a Pinterest account, personal accounts versus business accounts. We'll look at the various types of pinboards, understanding what they are and how to use them. And we're going to talk a little more in depth about this idea of content segmentation and the value associated with that. So if you've watched part one of this series and you don't already have a Pinterest account and you're finding yourself saying, okay, let's give this a try, let's get set up. The question becomes, how do you go in and actually do it? Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is whether or not it's in your best interest to set up a business account or a personal account. And a lot of that's going to depend on the size of your company and what your goals are. If you're an interior designer or a marketing consultant or someone that really sort of is your own business, setting up as personal may make sense. If you're a company of any size or enterprise, clearly you're going to want to set up as a business. If you're setting up as personal, when you go to Pinterest.com, they're going to let you sync it to your Facebook or set up an email address and a password. But if you're a business or if you're an individual who wants to set up as a business, you need to go to business.pinterest.com. And keep in mind, even if you are sort of a solopreneur or, a blogger, someone like that, you probably want to give serious consideration to setting up an account as a business and not just as an individual. And that's because as a business, you're going to have access to more marketing tools, to more options than you would just going in through your personal account. Now, if on the other hand, you have already set up an account, but you haven't really figured out how to leverage it, maybe you set up a personal account way back when and you've never done much with it. It's important to note that on the business account page, you do have an option to convert an existing account from a personal account into a business account. So you're going to want to make sure you go with that option rather than just setting up a duplicate. So when you're creating your business account, it's going to be fairly standard, same thing you'd do anyplace else. You're going to put in an email address and a password and the name of the business, and then they're going to take you into sort of your starting point. And that's where you're going to have the option to go in and do a couple different things. You might want to create your first board and start building some of those out. You might want to install the pin it button or the follow me button on your blog. Now we're going to talk about each of those a little bit further down the line. The one I want to focus on first, because the one that I think it is most essential for everyone to do when they're setting up a business account, is to take a couple moments to verify your website with Pinterest. So that's going to be the last option on the right there. And when you choose verify your website, they're going to give you a piece of code that you basically take back to your website and you're going to plug into the header code. So if you're someone that has access to the site, you can go do this in a matter of a minute or two. If not, this is just going to be a snippet of code that you're going to need to send over to your developer or your website person and say this needs to go into the header section. Once you've done that, you're going to be able to go back over to the site and you'll notice underneath your profile, you'll see a little red check that shows up next to your URL. Now, what that basically does is it tells Pinterest that this is a website that you do actually own. You're not just trying to associate yourself with it. And that's going to give you access down the road to things like Pinterest Analytics and some promoted pins and some additional marketing opportunities that you won't have if you don't take the time to make sure you put that verification in order. So you want to make sure that you do that as part of your business setup on Pinterest. Now, there's a couple things to note about getting started with your account, even beyond simple verification or setting up your first boards. One of those is the knowledge that unlike a lot of other social media channels, you're not currently going to have the ability to sync all of your other social media channels up. And that's because on Pinterest, the only way to link over to Facebook and sync up with Facebook is to sync with your personal account. So again, if you're going in as a business, you're probably not going to want to link Pinterest to your Facebook because there's not currently an option in place to just enter the URL for your business account on Facebook to let people jump straight into that. Now you can sync up your Twitter properly because you just need to enter your Twitter username and password. But again, because Facebook tends to be associated with a personal account that then has access to go into business accounts, it does not do the sync very well at all. You're also going to want to plan to clean out your news feed. Pinterest will not let you set up an account without picking a certain number of topics that you're interested in, and then they sort of auto follow people on your behalf. So chances are when you first log in, there's going to be a lot of content in your news feed that you might not actually be interested in. So you're unfortunately either going to have to learn to ignore it or take the time to click into those boards and unfollow those Pinterest users and those boards so you can just clean it up a little bit. And then you want to take the time to create just a handful of boards to start. You don't need to go in and create every board for every topic you think you're going to use. It's far better, in my opinion, to start with 3 to 5 boards and flesh them out with good quality content first. And then start to see where your interests lie, what seems to be getting a response, and start to add in boards from there. You've got plenty of time to go broader and deeper. Now, there's 4 different types of boards you need to know about. Some of them can sort of be used in conjunction with each other. Some of them, there's a little bit of nuances too. So the primary type of board is what's called a category board. So when you set up a board on Pinterest, and super simple to do, you're just clicking an add a board button. You're going to be asked to enter a name for the board and a description for the board, and then there's going to be a drop-down option to choose a category, and that's, again, a category board. So whether it's related to health and fitness or food or party planning, you're basically saying to Pinterest, the content that I put on this board has to do with this specific topic. So it's a generalized board that's going to be synced up with Pinterest's existing categories. That means it's viewable to all users. People can choose to follow it or not follow it, and the content that you put into that board has the opportunity to be selected by Pinterest as part of their broader category feeds. Now, there's another type of board that's called a secret board. And a secret board functions in much the same way that a category board does, except for the fact that it's not visible to anyone except the board owner and approved Pinterest users. And by approved Pinterest users, I mean you have added those users to the board and given them the right to also post their content into it. So it's basically just a way to leverage Pinterest and all the benefits of a Pinterest board in an environment that you have a little bit more control over. And we'll talk a little more in depth later in the series about different ways to leverage secret boards, both for marketing and content research, and even for things like PR and pitch outreach. Now, the next type of board is a places board. Now, you can have a category board that's a places board. You can also have a secret board that's a places board. So again, there's a little bit of opportunity for overlap there. And what a places board does is it syncs up the board itself with a map. And it allows you to put a geographical location in for each of the pins that you put up. Now, that may be because you're literally pinning locations in places, or it may be that you're making the choice to tie a location to an image or to a concept or to an idea that you've put in place. But when people click in to look at these boards, they're always going to see that map associated with it. They're going to see the pins that are in the board showing up on the map itself, so they can take a look and see sort of how things are laid out geographically. And then the final type of board I want to talk about today is a group board. So I mentioned this briefly on the secret board page, but it's basically a collaborative board. It allows you to invite other Pinterest users by name to come in and participate. Now you can have a category board that is a group board. You can have a secret board that's a group board. You can have a secret places board that's a group board. Again, there's a lot of opportunity for overlap here. And really, all this does is allow you to work in a collaborative manner with people so that you're not the only person that's putting pins in. Now, there's some challenges here because you want to make sure you don't just add anyone, because again, once you add them, you're giving them the ability to pin as well. So from the business perspective, you want to be a little bit careful on this and who you put in and who you give some editing access to, because it's not uncommon to see these types of boards potentially get spammed by a new user. So again, you want to make sure that these are people that you're actually familiar with and that you have a measure of trust in before you add them into a group board. So now that we have a basic idea of what the different types of pin boards are, it's good to get a walkthrough of what it actually looks like to go through that process of setting those up. So when you go into your Pinterest page, sort of your Pinterest profile, you're always going to see a create a board option that shows up towards the top and on the left. So clicking that create board option is going to launch a window that allows you to do things like enter the name of the board that you're putting together, write up a description of what it is, choose a category. These are all things that we've talked about doing, saying here's the category and the topic that I want it to be associated with. But then you also have the opportunity to turn it into a places board by adding a map or leaving the map option turned off, which will make it just a regular standard board. Now you can at any point in the future turn something into a places board without a problem. Now you also have the option to make it a secret board or not. So for this instance, I have turned it into a secret board because it's planning for a future event. It's important to note you can take a board that has been made secret and make it public, but you cannot take a public board and make it secret. Once it's public, it has to stay public. So if you think this is something that you may want to be a secret board, but maybe open up later, it's a good idea by default to start with it as secret. Otherwise, you'll have to go back and build a new board from scratch and repin everything into that board. And then once you've decided if you're going to make it a places board, if you're going to make it a secret board, you also have the option to type in names. And when you start typing those names in, they're going to pull up a list of the fellow pinners, people with accounts that match that name, and you have the ability to add virtually as many people as you want into the mix. But you can say, these are the people that I want to have access, and click that create board button, and then you're going to see that option show up. Now, it's important to note the people that you invite into the mix, they won't immediately show up. It's not until they have accepted your invitation that they'll actually show up. So just in case you set a board up and you're trying to figure out why everyone else isn't showing up there. Now from that point, you can click add a pin and you can start uploading pins, or you can go out and use Pinterest as you normally would, either clicking the repin button or using the pin it button on a website. And this new board is going to show up as one of your drop-down options for actually pinning content and getting it online. Now, when we look at things like category selection, it's important to remember that category selection is an important part of what actually gets your content out there into the mix. So when you take that original pin that you first put up, if it isn't associated with a category, if you pin it into a board that's not associated with a category, it's only going to go out to your existing followers. So in this instance, it was a post by Kendall Jackson Wines. So they have a little less than 2,000 followers. So it's going to broadcast out to some of those 2,000 followers based on the algorithm. And you're basically going to get limited repins, limited opportunity for exposure. Now, when we look at putting things into the category, now we have the opportunity that, again, Pinterest may take that pin and broadcast it out into the category area, which means you're not just getting the exposure to the people who have opted to follow your board, but to the millions of category viewers, which means lots of increased exposure, cyclical repins, and the chance for your content to go much further than it would have originally. Now, something else that's important to understand when we look at things like categories, and we mentioned the idea of getting our content out into categories or even into the homepages with people who have chosen to follow your content, is that Pinterest has put together an algorithm in much the same way that Facebook has the newsfeed algorithm or that Google has, their search engine algorithm. So Pinterest has what's known as the smart feed. And there's sort of three key concepts that go into the idea of the smart feed and how Pinterest decides what content is going to show up. Originally, when Pinterest was put together, it worked much like Twitter does, that content just showed up in the order that it was pinned. And if you had good timing for logging in or for getting your pins up there, you were going to show up in front of people. But now Pinterest is looking at mixing different sources of pins together at different rates. So instead of having one brand be able to come in and maybe take over your news feed because they've pinned, 57 different versions of putting together an outdoor patio, now Pinterest is saying, well, let's maybe pick the best of that content and let's pair it with some of the other content that maybe showed up a couple hours ago, but, is still new since the last time they logged in. So the idea is that some pins should be shown now while some are shown later. So there's a mix here that's a little different from what we might see on Facebook or on a search engine, that Pinterest isn't necessarily saying we're going to take the top value and put those in front of you now and toss the rest out. They're actively saying, look, we know that a lot of activity around pins is latent. It doesn't always happen immediately. So if we take that pin that someone you follow put up and we don't show it to you for a week or two, you're probably still going to be interested in it. So there's a little bit of nuances there in terms of understanding that just because it doesn't show up originally doesn't necessarily mean it won't show up at all. But there's also the idea here that pins have different value based on the source and the topic. So Pinterest is going to be looking at the type of content that you're pinning and putting together. They're going to look at the quality of the pins and how other people have responded to them. They're going to use that information to figure out which one is going to be approved and actually show up for you versus which ones might not be the best fit and there's just no reason to have it show up in your newsfeed. So it's going to take a lot of time for this to really get sort of reverse engineered and better understood.
Hey, want to become an expert in digital marketing? Then subscribe to the Simplilearn channel and click here to watch more such videos. To nerd up and get certified in digital marketing, click here.